Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/ProRevenge. In today's episode, fire me? You're all losing your jobs. Mess with my kids. That's gonna cost you a pretty penny and get you in trouble with the law. They tore up my grandfather's garden. He tore up their car. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. Fire me? You're all losing your jobs. My 2019 was wild. But with everything finally on the up and up, I feel I can tell this story here. After uni, late 2018, I fell on rough times and was forced to move back to my hometown. I tried to transfer my job to a branch in my area but failed, thus I needed to get a new job. I settled for a 20-hour-a-week job at a Bookies, with a second bartending job in the evenings. The Bookies is the target for my revenge, which was entirely accidental. Involved are the following: Janelle, my manager's manager; Shay, my manager; Jorge and Gordon, my coworkers; and Kara, a coworker at another store, who is relevant later, names changed and / or redacted. I ended up working behind the counter as a customer service manager, basically a step up from a cashier. It's fancy when seen on a CV, but there's nothing really to it. I took bets, chatted with customers, helped people with machines, and, for the vast majority of my shift, sat around waiting for something to do. I got on well with my coworkers, or so I thought, and had no major issues. It was 20 hours a week, about £1 more than minimum wage, with a lot of overtime required of me and irregular shift patterns. Though I had no issue with the job, beyond how difficult it was to juggle the schedules of both of my jobs. In February of 2019, after working for the company for 6 months, I was invited to a probation hearing. It cannot be emphasized enough that it was a probation hearing in which I would have my performance reviewed and, as informed in training, was entitled to a pay rise at the end of it. I arrived that morning to a disciplinary hearing where, without even a shred of evidence, I was accused of 11 different cash discrepancies dating back to early November of 2018. Shortly after I'd started, which all amounted to £271.36. All but one of which I'd never heard of before. These had apparently been reported and logged by my manager, Shay, and my coworkers, despite no one saying a word to me at all. Not a whisper in the 5 months this had apparently been occurring. I was told that it was unacceptable, a call was made to HR, and I was terminated on the spot and forced to hand over my keys, and to never set foot in the store again. To my protests, I was told the decision could not be appealed, and I would eventually receive written confirmation of my employment's termination in the post. I didn't let myself slump around and feel sorry for myself, so, on the way home, I opened up Indeed and applied for a bunch of jobs and, before I arrived home, had an interview set up for the next week at what is my current place of work. Now, I was furious. Fuming at having gone to what I thought should have been a normal probation meeting and having, effectively, been called a thief and been banned for life from a place I'd never go to anyway. But somehow, my parents were angrier and ordered me to let them know when they got into contact with me again. Almost 2 weeks later, I received an email from the company's HR which reiterated the accusations and stated, again, that I was terminated. My mom sat me down in her kitchen and walked me through a letter response that was 2 parts professional and 3 parts scathing. Ripping into them about their unprofessional conduct, their ludicrous claims, their lack of evidence, the holes in their story, because there were quite a few, and finally, the cherry on the cake: the employment laws they'd broken. Now I didn't want much, just a nice reference. A promise that not a whisper of these accusations would turn up when my new job asked them for a reference, because by then, I'd already been offered the job. I then attached the letter to an email to fire back at their HR department. Then I added Janelle's work email. Then her boss's email, and finally, the holding company that owned the brand. 'Cause I wanted to make sure this was seen. A bit of background: the Bookies I worked for is a brand that is owned by an international company. Their name, behind the scenes, is slapped on everything, and they pretty much dictate everything we did. I'm not sure if holding company is the correct term, but I'll stick to that for now. Anyway, I sent this email with a 48-hour window for a response. I received a reply the next day from the same email that my demands were being met. I smirked victoriously and moved on with my life, happy to wash my hands with the entire ordeal. However, I'd set off a chain reaction that I wouldn't know about until 3 months later. 3 months on, I'd settled into my new job, a call center position with double the hours and well over double the pay. I'd gone through training and was settling into my new position when I see a new set of trainees settling in near my team. Among them was Gordon, one of my coworkers from the bookies. I was stunned. Gordon had been at the bookies for 6 years when I joined. He was well liked, good at his job and a favorite of the managers. There was no way he'd been fired. Though I didn't really want to talk to him, as I was of the impression that he, Jorge, and my manager had likely set me up, I did want to know what happened. Luckily, on seeing me in the break room one shift, he sought me out and told me everything. Apparently my email had been read by the higher-ups in the holding company, and had caused a lot of scrutiny to fall onto the bookies in our town, of which there were 3 in our area that Janelle was responsible for, 2 in my town and a third in a neighboring one. Someone in HR passed a message down to the area manager, Janelle's boss, claiming they wanted things investigated and they wanted results yesterday, causing him to drop everything and descend on our little town with the panic and aggression of a man whose superiors were watching his every breath. He went to Janelle wanting to know why he hadn't been made aware previously that I was apparently stealing money, why I had been given keys to the shop and shifts on my own when allegations of that nature were attributed to me, and why I hadn't been put under investigation. Turns out, Janelle had in fact put in my employee file that I was under investigation, but had never actually gone through with any of the official procedures for monitoring and investigating me. Shock horror. Thus she had fired me for the accused crime without looking into it at all, falsely claiming otherwise. Thus, the area manager took the dates and amounts of the cash discrepancies, confirmed that they had been reported on those days, without my knowledge, in Shay's own log book of the shop's cash, and sent that information onto our security team to investigate. Another little detail is that the CCTV for every shop in the brand is outsourced to a private security company who monitors each shop remotely, and has access to all the cameras and video. As was procedure, they looked into the dates mentioned to see if I'd been doing anything untoward. I know I wasn't, and nothing was ever said to me. But they did find something. Turns out, money was going missing from the shop, but surprise surprise, it wasn't me but Jorge and Shay. They not only set me up for reasons I will never know, but were also falsifying numbers and cash checks on the system to hide it. One thing Shay was caught doing was deliberately short-changing customers by taking portions of their winnings without them even knowing it. Bear in mind, a lot of our customers were elderly men and women. Gordon claims that he once opened the shop, after I and Shay had closed the night before, and noticed a cash difference, but had been told not to say anything to me as I was under investigation, and it could compromise it. He did apologize and I let it go. Needless to say, Jorge and Shay were fired. But it doesn't end there. Our team was small, including me. There were a total of 4 people working at the store. As they hadn't been able to hire anyone to replace me, Jorge and Shay's termination meant Gordon was the only employee at the busiest shop in our area. Even if they'd been able to get other colleagues from the 2 other shops to help out, it wouldn't have been enough to keep the shop open and manage the amount of customers. So they closed the location down until they could get the staff to run it. It was at that point that Gordon handed in his resignation and applied for his job at my work. Meaning they had no one. On top of that, Gordon's girlfriend worked in the same shop as Janelle, and she relayed that she was rarely at their store, in the other town, for the next few weeks before the area manager reported she was fired as well. No reason given to her. I was later issued an apology for everything by the area manager and informed she, Janelle, was no longer with the company in an email sometime later. But somehow, it doesn't end there. With the store I worked at closed, this one being on the high street, and where most people preferred to go, the only other location in town was the much smaller location in the suburbs. The one where Kara worked. Alone. She suddenly received an influx of customers into her tiny store space and absolutely no support from other staff or upper management. Thus, for her own mental health, having already been overworked and underpaid, running an entire store by herself, she quit, meaning that location had to be closed down too. All of this at the worst possible time, March, when the Cheltenham Festival was occurring. Which is a huge money maker for the gambling industry, even in a small town like ours. An opportunity the 3 other bookies on the high street reaped the benefits of instead of my old place, as the former customers went to them instead. As it currently stands, just over a year later, both shops remain closed, and I'm currently entering a job in cybersecurity, the training for which I paid for with my current job. Thanks for firing me, dumbass, you did me a favor. Mess with my kids. That's gonna cost you a pretty penny and get you in trouble with the law. So, I've got an acquaintance, Richard, who has always been of the I know better than you school of thought. What makes it worse is that he literally received his PhD in physics from one of my country's top universities about 6 months ago, so he's not a dummy. The problem is that he thinks that because he's a physics genius, that means he knows better than everyone about everything. Just an example, my kids are in Montessori schools. This is a decision my wife and I reached together, and we're very happy with it. When he heard, he went on a 30-minute rant/lecture about how we're throwing our money away and Montessori is nonsense. When I told him that I had read and even professionally translated studies proving the opposite, and gave him some real-world examples, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, Jeff Bezos, Larry Page, etc., he still would not admit he might not be 100% correct. Not the subject of this revenge, but so you understand the person we're dealing with. Another thing that's important to note is that Richard does not have Asperger's or anything similar. We joke about this all the time, and he's been tested from here until next week. He's just a really smart, socially oblivious, pain in the ass. Given all of the above, I try to limit my time with him, but unfortunately, that isn't always possible, and last week we were both at the same group break for a friend, Jack, who was visiting back home from overseas. I've known Jack since grade school, so we brought our families and made it more than just a long time, no-see type of thing. At some point later on in the afternoon my eldest, Awesome, less than 10 years old, came to me really sad and said she wanted to go home. When I asked her why, she said that Richard had just spent 15 minutes telling her that she shouldn't eat hot dogs because they're unhealthy, and he explained what went into hot dogs and what they're made out of. Awesome is not a vegetarian, knows that the beef and chicken she eats used to be live animals, and has never professed interest in vegetarianism. At the same time, when a kid is eating a hot dog, they don't care or want to know what's inside. We spoke a bit, I calmed her down and I told her to ignore Richard and go play with her siblings and her friends. Being a kid, she was thankfully easily distracted by something else and moved on. I didn't want to make a fuss with Jack or with Richard, so I just let it be. This turned out to be a mistake. About 30 minutes later I heard Awesome scream and begin crying. I ran over to her. Richard had come up to her and knocked her hot dog out of her hand, saying she shouldn't eat that garbage. I handed Awesome over to my wife for damage control, and I took Richard aside and told him that A, you don't ever talk to a man's kids without permission, B, you don't ever teach a man's kids without permission, and C, you sure as shit don't ever touch a man's kids without permission. He doesn't have kids, so I still wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. This turned out to be a mistake. Instead of doing the mature thing and moving on, he decided to double down on the hot dog issue. This was the hill he was going to die on. My kids shouldn't be eating hot dogs. Keeping Jack in mind, I disengaged and told him to stay the fuck away from my family. For the rest of the RV, I kept my eye on him, and he didn't come near them. Jack enjoyed, we all ate some good meat, end of the story as far as I'm concerned. This turned out to be a mistake. A few days later we received a visit from a child protection officer who claimed that we were neglecting our kids, specifically Awesome. She came in and saw that while the house could have been cleaner, what house with kids is spotless, everything was fine. She sat with Awesome for a few minutes and asked her some questions, said everything was fine, and left. First thing I did was call a friend of mine who was a lawyer, just to be on the safe side. He said it looked to him like we were in the clear, but we should keep in touch with him just in case. Next, I began working the grapevine. It turned out that Richard had been offended by how I treated him after the hot dog incident, so he filed a false anonymous report. Being Richard, and never thinking he could ever be wrong, he was even talking about it, as if people should be proud of him for what he did. I had to make sure though, so the last thing I did before dropping the hammer on him was confronting him personally. I set my phone to record and went to his house. He doubled down yet again, saying we were torturing Awesome, he's the one who called protective services on us, and he'd do it again in a heartbeat. This turned out to be a mistake. I'm not the violent type, but I swore I wanted to break the son of a bitch in half. I told him that if he came near myself or anyone in my family again, I'd have a restraining order put out on him, and I'd make sure every single one of our shared acquaintances knew why. I listened to the recording in my car, and his admission that he filed a false report came out clear as day. I immediately forwarded it to my lawyer, who said he'll get the ball rolling with some friends of his with the public prosecutor to see if we could get Richard in trouble, using his admission. Still waiting on that, the wheels of justice turn slowly sometimes. Then, I enacted my actual revenge. See, after he got his PhD, Richard bragged about the new flat he'd be moving into as soon as he sold his current flat. To that end, he renovated most of his current flat, including putting in lots of new, and expensive, features that required lots of electrical work. He did the same on his new flat. He did most of the electrical work himself, which is a big no-no unless you're licensed. I called in an inspector on both of his flats, who asked to see certification on who did the electrical work. Obviously, there was no certification. It wouldn't surprise me if, Richard being Richard, he began arguing with the inspector that his work was good enough and he didn't need to pay someone else to do it for him. I haven't seen or spoken to Richard since, but I've heard that he had to bring in a certified electrician to examine every single change he made in both flats. This meant dismantling everything and having it inspected. Turns out the buyers of his old flat weren't happy with the delay in receiving the keys, and were even unhappier when they learned why there was a delay. They walked away from the deal and are taking him to court. Because his sale fell through, he's now in the hole paying mortgages on 2 flats. I don't know if there was a fine levied against him, but I sure as hell hope so. Lesson of the story: you don't ever fuck with a man's kids. They tore up my grandfather's garden. He tore up their car. My dad told me this story a few years back. My grandfather lived in a really rural area in Georgia. This was around the late 1930s, early 1940. My grandfather owned a farm and had a garden. He had planted various veggies. Well, the only neighbors were about a mile away. And for some reason the neighbors would drive their Model T through the garden, tearing up the veggies. My grandpa would have to replant the garden. The neighbors kept doing this. So here comes the revenge part. My grandfather dug holes around the garden and stuck metal poles into the holes. He covered up the holes with leaves. A few days later the neighbors drove through again. My dad said they tore the undercarriage out and had parts strewn all over the place. He couldn't remember what happened after that. But I don't think they did that again. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.